Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll cover heat waves in Southeast Asia and bank fraud in Vietnam.
We'll also give you updates on Singapore-Johor relations and the latest on Prabowo's presidential confirmation. I'm Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet and. Today is May 2nd, 2024. On today's interview,
this week is really quite intense for U.S Philippine relations. As you mentioned, we have had the trilateral and then the Philippine-U.S bilateral on the sidelines. Then we have Balikatan. But this week, we also had the bilateral strategic dialogue, which is the senior level coordinating mechanism for U.S Philippine relations for the alliance. And next week, in fact, we will also have the U.S Philippines space dialogue, which was an offshoot of these bilateral dialogues. And the idea is to provide an avenue for closer Philippines-U.S. space relations.
Greg and Elina were joined by July Amador to discuss the latest developments in the U.S Philippine alliance. Before that, let's start with our headlines. Lauren, it's so hot outside.
It really is. This is like the first time I've worn a short sleeve to the office in forever.
I don't blame you. It was boiling. I was running over the weekend, and it was just the most miserable experience. Anyway.
But I'm here for the hot weather. I mean,
it's a great departure from the cold.
Reminds me of Singapore.
Love that. But it looks like Southeast Asia has had it even worse with the weather lately. Unusually hot weather has blasted the region for the past week.
Some regions, such as in central Myanmar, saw temperatures as high as 48 degrees Celsius.
For our friends who need a conversion, that's over 118 degrees Fahrenheit.
Authorities in several Southeast Asian countries had to issue health warnings given the severe consequences of heat exposure.
In Thailand, 30 people have died due to the high temperatures this year alone, according to government data.
The Philippines even canceled in-person classes at public schools for several days.
Meanwhile, facing the worst drought in years, the Philippines could experience crop losses amounting to more than $69 million.
The consequences of global warming haven't been clearer in Southeast Asia.
Maybe this heat could spark a stronger wave of climate legislation in the region?
I hope so. For our next story, we're looking at Vietnam, where earlier this month, a Vietnamese property tycoon was sentenced to death.
Trong My Lan was found guilty of siphoning off more than $12.5 billion from the Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank, or SCB, with her accomplices.
This is Vietnam's biggest financial fraud case ever. The stolen money amounted to about 6% of the country's GDP.
The sentencing is part of a larger crackdown on corruption in Vietnam, which has seen hundreds of senior state officials and high-profile business executives prosecuted or forced to step down.
Revealing the vulnerabilities of Vietnam's banks, the fraud case has shaken trust amongst the public and companies operating in Vietnam.
A total of 42,000 victims saw their savings and investments in SCB evaporate.
Reuters reported that Vietnam's central government has mounted an unprecedented $24 billion rescue of SCB through special loans, raising concerns about the capacity of the national treasury.
Totally fair concerns. Let's move on to our next story, though. We have updates from Singapore and the southern Malaysian state of Johor, which are jointly developing a special economic zone.
With a long history of cooperation between Singapore and Johor, the governments are aiming to attract investments and free up movement of goods and people with updated procedures, infrastructure, and technology.
Right. Malaysia will soon roll out QR code immigration systems for factory workers commuting into Singapore.
This involves workers using a unique QR code to cross immigration instead of having to present their passports.
Sounds handy. A similar system already exists for cars traveling from Malaysia to Singapore's Woodlands and Tuas checkpoints.
Malaysia's Transport Minister, Anthony Loke, also recently announced that ongoing construction for a new Rapid Transit System link, or RTS link, between Johor and Singapore is about 70% complete.
If completed in 2026 as planned, RTS Link will be able to carry 10,000 passengers per hour in each direction.
The link is expected to ease traffic congestion on the causeway, as hundreds of thousands of people cross the shared border daily for work or leisure.
Johor is also aiming to improve its public transportation systems in advance of the RTS Link completion.
This month, the state government of Johor has proposed a multi-tiered autonomous rapid transit system to replace an existing plan for a light rail transit system.
If approved by the federal government, the system may improve connectivity between Johor's outlying areas and major connection points, including Johor's International Airport and the future RTS link with Singapore. Let's move on to the last story. We're looking at developments following February's presidential election in Indonesia.
Last week, an Indonesian court officially brought an end to all election disputes.
The court found no evidence of systematic fraud and presidential meddling in the election, rejecting challenges from both losing candidates seeking a rerun of the election and the disqualification of winner Prabowo Subianto.
The ruling effectively marked the end of the election, candidate Anies Baswedan said in a video address. stating he was committed to a peaceful governmental transition and called Prabowo a patriot.
2 days after the court ruling, President-elect Prabowo Subianto was confirmed the winner in a ceremony.
During his confirmation speech, he vowed to fight for all Indonesians and called for unity amongst political elites to take the country forward.
He'll officially take office in October and will work to boost his parliamentary clout and general popularity in the meantime. And those were our headlines. Up next, Greg and Elina's interview with July Amador. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to another episode of Southeast Asia Radio. As always, I'm Greg Poling with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, joined by co-host Elina Noor with the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Hey, Greg.
And special guest today is Julio Amador, or July, as his friends call him. July is the executive director of the Philippine American Education Foundation, based in Manila. And this week, we've had July with us at CSIS in Washington for a tabletop exercise we've been running on energy security and the alliance, which we can't really share details because it's all Chatham House, but there will be a forthcoming report. But the reason we brought July on was to talk about U.S. Philippine relations writ large. So before we get into it, hey, July, thanks for joining.
Hi, Greg. Hi, Elina. Thank you for having me here. I've heard so much about this podcast, and now I'm apparently the next victim. So,
yeah, this is going to push us up to that next level. We've been floundering, and we need to borrow some of your star power.
Or it might drag your reputation in the mud, July. One of those.
one of those.
There's no such thing as bad press. So be as provocative as you like. It's a very busy time in U.S. Philippine relations, right? We had, besides the now monthly news cycle driven by China's violence toward Philippine resupply missions around Second Thomas Shoal, we had the first ever quadrilateral maritime exercise in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone early last month with the U.S., Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. Then we had the first ever trilateral summit of the leaders during Prime Minister Kishida's state visit to Washington. President Marcos also came and they had their trilateral, and then a series of bilateral meetings afterwards on the U.S. and Philippine side. And then we had the kickoff of Balikatan this week. So we're recording on April 24th. This will come out on May 2nd, during which it'll still be in the middle of Balikatan. And this is supposed to be the biggest and most advanced Balikatan shoulder-to-shoulder exercises ever for a number of reasons. So a lot to pick apart, but why don't we start with the trilateral, since I think that was probably the most newsworthy. We covered it a bit here in Washington, but how was this trilateral viewed back in Manila, July?
Greg, I also like to note that even with the trilateral, right, the bilateral meeting with President Biden actually had a lot of things going on, and in itself is as important for us as the trilateral. So yeah, the trilateral, I think, is a welcome development for the Philippines. As you know, all of the issues with China, particularly in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, has been pushing the Philippines to seek a closer relations, particularly in defense and security with partners. Japan is one of the Philippines' strategic partners, along with Vietnam and now Australia. So you could see that there's just a natural affinity for that. And the Trilateral Security Summit, which basically is the first island chain alignment for the Philippines and Japan as U.S. allies, is one of those developments. But I also like to add, Greg, that this week is really quite intense for U.S. Philippine relations. As you mentioned, we have had the trilateral and then the Philippine-U.S. bilateral on the sidelines. Then we have Balikatan. But this week, we also had the bilateral strategic dialogue, which is the senior level coordinating mechanism for U.S. Philippine relations for the alliance. And next week, in fact, we will also have the U.S. Philippines space dialogue, which was an offshoot of these bilateral dialogues. And the idea is to provide an avenue for closer Philippines-U.S. space relations. So, so this has just been an intense and heavy week for the alliance.
The space trajectory is a curious one for me, but before we get into that, I've noticed that there's been a bit of, I don't know what the right word is, but what's been reported in the press, all the media headlines seem to point to an emphasis and a strengthening of the defense and security relations between the U.S. and the Philippines and between the U.S., Philippines, and Japan. But all the official statements seem to prioritize the economic dimension of the bilateral and trilateral relationship. What's the real story here, July?
I think they're not mutually exclusive, and I do agree with your observation, Elina, because this is what Marcos himself has said, that economic security is national security, and the Philippines wants to see that the alliance should move not beyond, but should move forward in other areas, particularly bilateral economic relations. So we actually just have the trade visit, presidential trade mission, which was one of the, I think, most unique feature recently in economic relations. And then next month, you have the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, which will be hosted in Manila. So that tells you that both sides are really looking forward to having more trade and having more investments in the Philippines from U.S. firms and companies. I should like to add that before I left, I actually saw in the news that Americans have actually outstripped the Chinese in terms of real estate rentals in the Philippines, which I think is good news. There's renewed interest and renewed vibrancy in the way that the international business community is looking at the Philippines as a destination country for investment. Beyond that, I might move it to government propaganda. So let's stop there.
This is, it feels to me at least, a potential turning point for Philippine economy, at least in the eyes of foreign investors overall, right? The economy, the government's target is 6 to 7% growth this year. When you look at most of the credit rating agencies, the big banks and the multilateral institutions, it's 5.5 to 6.5, which is probably going to make the Philippines the fastest growing large economy in Asia this year and next year. If we look at the projections, at least. You have a huge amount of attention now on semiconductors, looking at the Philippines, where you've had legacy chips being made by Texas Instruments for decades. The story in the press often still revolves around India and Vietnam. I think increasingly you're seeing Western companies, at least, and Japanese companies taking a look at the Philippines in a way they probably haven't since the 1980s and really liking what they see. And so the Biden administration's role is really just to nudge that as much as they can. I think it'll be private sector driven, but having things like the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Manila, the announcement that the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment will open its first Asian infrastructure corridor in Luzon, that the U.S. Development Finance Corp will open its first ever Asian office in Manila. All of this is important signaling and could certainly help along the margins in getting U.S. investors who maybe would be on the fence about a specific investment in the Philippines to make the leap.
And also, Greg, I think it was in the news, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is again looking towards partnering with the Philippines, and that would mean more U.S. government incentives. As you said, nudging towards the Philippines as a destination country for investments. And I think from the start of his administration, Marcos has always been telling everyone that the Philippines is open for business. And that message has been consistent. And I think in the Philippines, the government agencies responsible for economic development and trade have been really pushing for more business to consider moving to the Philippines, I think, particularly with partner countries. But really, there's no preference, so to speak. The idea really is that the Philippines is looking forward to working with foreign businesses. They want more investments, particularly in these critical areas. The Department of Trade and Industry, for example, is looking at how AI could be a tool actually to help our business process outsourcing industry. So it's not really, there's a sense of optimism that all of these new developments in tech, for example, could be taken advantage of rather than be seen as a way of reducing the Philippines' competitive advantage in this area. So that I think has been consistent in the messaging of this government that the Philippines is open for business. So as you've said, beyond the security aspect of the relationship, there's actually a lot of dynamism in economics and trade.
Is this dynamism being felt at the ground level? There was a recent survey I saw in the news. Granted, the sample size was really small. I think about 1,500 people were polled, talking about how Filipinos on the ground were mainly concerned about economic areas and jobs, which is true of many populations around the world. And there was a sense that maybe Marcos Jr. is focusing a little more on defense and security issues than what he had promised in his campaign manifesto. Are his economic appeal efforts being felt amongst voters?
There's always been a good question, right, Elina, when it comes to all of these discussions about trade and investments, because how do we really know if this trickled down? Or we don't even want to use that kind of language. But I think your point is well taken, because last year, for example, the government spent a lot of time fighting inflation, had one of the highest inflation records in the in its immediate neighborhood. But this year, I think the numbers are better. And so it's really a question of addressing those perennial problems that beset the Philippine economy. When you talk about food, for example, then you're talking about logistics and supply chains that need to be addressed so that food can flow freely into other areas. Energy is still a very nasty thing in terms of preventing more investments because we have one, if not the highest energy costs in the region. And that's also felt by, at least at the household level, for those of us who have to pay, right? Energy is expensive in the Philippines. Electricity is expensive. Internet has somewhat improved since Duterte made those changes during his administration. But, still, the Philippines needs to do better in improving its internet speed. These are the things that actually would hinder future foreign investors, coupled, of course, with the problems that need to be resolved in terms of transaction costs, particularly in business registrations and so on. The ease of doing business needs to be considerably improved. And I'm saying this as someone who has to register every year. The process has, I think, remained the same, and that might deter future investors who have to look at the number of transactions that they have to do, which means the number of days and hours that they have to spend registering a business and making it operational is still quite high. And these are I think, some of the major challenges that the government needs to address because they remain there. So if the government says that we are open or the Philippines is open for business, then reforms must also be made to ensure that when those businesses do come in, they feel welcome and not hindered or hobbled by all of these regulations.
I think it's very telling that as you lay out the list of priorities for the administration and then you line those up with the list of efforts made by the Biden administration and the Japanese government in particular, it's almost one-to-one, right? Since Marcos came into power, he made himself agriculture secretary. He's been talking about food security, energy security. He's got a particular focus on nuclear power for whatever reason. He talks a lot about cyber security. And then you look at the announcements that are made during the trilateral summit and the bilaterals with the PGI corridor, heavy focus on food security, energy security, a new cyber mechanism. It seems to me that not just the U.S., but all of the allies and partners who are deepening their relations with the Philippines are really going out of their way to be responsive to Marcos' administration priorities. I mean, in a way that's, I think, unusual. It suggests a certain respect, deference to the Philippines that we have not seen probably ever.
I think I describe that to the optimism that many of these partner countries feel with regard to how the Philippines is handling its foreign relations, but also looking into how domestic reforms are being done, and they like what they see, apparently. And as you mentioned, the fact that these countries are looking at the Philippines' leadership in what it wants to prioritize is actually a good thing because it provides also accountability to the Philippines, right? In the sense that in the future, when these partner countries ask, isn't that what you wanted, right? So I think this is important because then it makes the Philippine government feel responsible and feel that it is really part of the process where it tells its partner countries, its allies, that this is what we want. These are the things that we prioritize. Because before, the experience was these countries come to the Philippines and say, this is what we will give, take it or leave it. And I think at this time, having this partnership approach where allied countries look to the Philippines' goals as the way to also identify what they can help with, I think it's a good thing. But then it should push the Philippines to be more responsive and actually have a plan on how to work with the U.S., with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, for example. Should I include the European Union? Maybe we should just mention them, that they are welcome to invest in the Philippines. But this is not to say that we're only looking at these so-called Western countries, right? We are looking at Southeast Asian countries as well. In fact, China is also free to invest in the Philippines. I don't think there's prohibition in that area. So the Philippines is very much open to doing business based on what the government has been announcing.
So thanks for bringing up China, July, because I was going to raise that piece of the equation, which I think we would be remiss to do. It's a bit of a tightrope, I think, for Marcos having to balance the Philippines' relations, increasingly deepening relations with Western allies and partners, plus Japan, having to not antagonize China too much, especially on the investment front. How's that going? domestically?
Good question, Elina, because this is actually an area where we need to dispel some misinformation. For one thing, the Philippines is still part of the Belt and Road. That was actually one of the things that Marcos accomplished when he made a state visit to Beijing. He re-signed the Philippines onto the BRI, which means we're part of it. Apparently, China's response has been tepid and downright against what Marcos has been doing. Case in point, the supposed Mindanao rail projects, which China promised to fund. And if you look at the news, the Philippines was waiting for China to say, yes, the funding will continue. The Philippines gave a deadline and said, look, you have to tell us if you are still interested in this. And they received the equivalent of a sin zone. They were sin zoned basically by China. China did not respond, and then you had news that Korea, Japan, and India were among those interested to take over the rail project. The rail project would have benefited both countries. It was going to be a loan, which means that regardless of what's gonna happen, the Philippines will need to pay if China did give the money. From what I could tell, the rail was a straight line infrastructure, so easy to do. Most of the right-of-way issues, which are a problem when it comes to this kind of infrastructures, were more or less resolved. So it was something that the Philippines and China could have worked on, but apparently the Chinese were not interested.
I hate to do it, but let's pivot to security matters. Let me lay out a hypothesis, and you tell me if I'm being naive. But when I look at what's happening in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea over the last 2 years, so predating the Marcos administration, but accelerating under the Marcos administration, we have increasing tensions, certainly, increasing gray zone coercion. We've had several rammings, I think 3 separate collisions between the China Coast Guard militia and Philippine government vessels. Had 2 incidents in which water cannons were used to injure Philippine sailors, including, as I understand it, an Admiral Carlos in charge of Westcom. I mean, pretty aggressive stuff. And yet, China has tried to block every resupply mission to the Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal for over 2 years, and every single one has gotten through. The Philippines continues to bring in construction materials to the Sierra Madre despite China's objections. The Philippine Coast Guard is now regularly patrolling Scarborough Shoal for the first time in 12 years. China gets shown on nightly news around the world as a bully on a monthly basis every time this happens. And it's driving the Philippines to tighten not just the alliance with the Americans, which I think is really a generational shift in the alliance, but also develop these new security partnerships with Japan, with New Zealand. Most recently, we have the announcement of the effort for a status of forces agreement with New Zealand. The French Navy will be taking part in Balikatan. This looks to me like a strategic loss for China, and that the Philippines is actually the one well on its way to establishing a sustainable status quo. Still high risk. I mean, we could get fatalities any day if China continues this, but it sure looks to me like the Philippines is accomplishing its goals on a monthly basis, and China hasn't accomplished a goal for 2 years.
Well, my answer would be roundabout, Greg. Let's just start with the fact that the Philippines does not have a choice in this matter. If it gives up on Ayungin, the problem with that would be...
Ayungin being Second Thomas Shoal, for those who haven't memorized the alternative names of every feature in the South China Sea like some of us.
Second Thomas Shoal, the thing is, the tribunal decision ruled that it's not an island, right? So basically, it's a submerged feature. The Philippines has every sovereign right to do what it wants with Second Thomas Shoal or Ayungin. So it becomes a matter of principle for the Philippines, because if it gives up on Ayungin, then that means it cannot press on its rights on mischief in other areas because you gave up. And then that would be open season basically for those other claimant countries. So you see, everyone actually has a stake here, because if we lay down the principle, or if we reject the principle that countries have sovereign rights over these submerged features under international law, then would that mean that then another country could just lay claim to it later on and dispute every right that each country will have on these kind of features? So you see, the Philippines on its own needs to stand up to China when it comes to Ayungin or the Second Thomas Shoal, but it has regional implications, particularly for those countries that have similar claims, similar features in the South China Sea. So that is a matter of principle. The second is that the alliance credibility is also on the line when it comes to Ayungin. If the Philippines, the Sierra Madre, which has been grounded there, is removed, and the allies are not able to do anything about it, then that would spell the end of U.S. credibility. Personally, I felt that credibility has been severely damaged in 2012, and we have not really returned to the level of trust that we should expect between the Philippines and the U.S. But Ayungin therefore becomes something of a flashpoint for the alliance. More importantly, I think when we talk about the South China Sea and for the Philippines, at the end of the day, it's really China's fault for not giving an inch, not really allowing for space for dialogue, not giving the Philippines face, as China always proclaims when, it thinks that its rights have been trampled upon. But in this case, the Philippines has done its best through its mechanisms such as the bilateral consultation mechanism between Beijing and Manila, which has met regularly, and then the other bilateral meetings between China and the Philippines. What they say then in these meetings apparently seem to be the opposite of what they do and say in public, which makes it difficult basically to build trust between the two countries. All of this is to say is that at the end of the day, it is the Philippines that will have to take the lead in this situation. It's really good to see allied countries or partners follow the Philippines' lead and basically looking towards bolstering Philippine capacities and capabilities. But really, if we were to advise China, right, it should look into the picture more closely and see the fact that the Philippines is going to have a reciprocal access agreement with Japan, is having some dialogues on defense cooperation with other countries, and other countries are proposing visiting forces agreements with the Philippines. These are signs that the region, particularly these countries, are feeling that China has been too much or has done too much to damage or destabilize regional security.
And this is a delicate piece that has to be maintained, right? How sustainable is it? Because all it takes is one incident that spirals out of control. How enduring do you think this arrangement could be for the region?
For one thing, Elina, I'm a bit worried actually. President Marcos has said that what will trigger the MDT is if someone gets killed. And China's actions recently have seemed to indicate that they don't actually care about the damage that they are causing. Like, can you imagine what would have happened if the supply ship has been, with the water cannons, someone was sliced through with the glasses that were broken. And there was, in fact, the commander of the Westcom there, the Vice Admiral Carlos was present in the resupply ship. What would have happened, for example, if something, he would basically unalive, as they say, during these incidents. These are things that indicate that we are in really dangerous situation. All it takes is the right angle for the water cannon to hit and damage that resupply vessel. And you could see the way that the Philippines is doing a lot of putting a lot of good faith into the situation. We are not using naval assets. We are not using PCG assets. We are using a civilian vessel to resupply our ships. The Coast Guard is there, for example, just to guard and to guide the resupply, which is a very tiny boat, if you look at it from the pictures. So if you look at it, the Philippines has done its best not to militarize the situation, not to antagonize China, but China doesn't seem to think that these gestures are worth a change in its outlook and behavior. And all of this is to say is that it has been China that has been consistent in flagrantly violating international law and international security in that area. Now you can see that it is insisting on publicizing the so-called gentleman's agreement in managing the disputes. But at the end of the day, whether that agreement exists or not, and all indications say that there's no agreement that was recorded, at the end of the day, China has no right to demand anything in the second Thomas Shoal on the West Philippine Sea towards the Philippines. That is the Philippines' position, and I think that is only fair given the tribunal decision in international law, particularly UNCLOS, when it comes to the second Thomas Shoal and the surrounding features.
I also find it very telling the way China reacts to these things publicly, whether it's the trilateral, every complaint about the resupply missions, or now the reaction to Balikatan. It's always the same line. It's finger wagging and hectoring the Philippines to stop letting itself be used as a pawn of the United States, completely ignoring the fact that the Philippines has any interests, any legitimate agency in the disputes. And I don't really know how it's possible to have a good faith dialogue when the public messaging is that the Philippines is effectively beneath China's concern, that it's not even worth talking to because Manila is nothing but a foil for Washington in Beijing's, at least their official worldview.
Which is a bit saddening because if you remember, the first year of Marcos was designed to placate China and to develop working relations with China. I remember during the elections, he did not say a lot of things with regard to South China Sea. And his first year was really designed to, again, to send a message that Manila is open for business. China is included in those countries that Manila wanted to send a message to. Again, Marcos visited Beijing as one of his first acts as president. So basically, it was the Philippines that was reaching out to China and telling them, look, we can work together on these issues. And then China, at every opportunity, was able to say no to the Philippines. So you're right. At this point, good faith, I think, is being reduced. And I don't know until when the Philippines can hold out and has to be more robust in its response. As you may have noticed, the transparency initiative that parts of the government have been doing I think were happening precisely because China's actions were getting worse. And they have been consistent at this kind of actions. And the Philippines has been pushed to a corner when it comes to these confrontations in the South China Sea.
I think we could have a whole series of conversations on the Philippines and the South China Sea. But I do want to chip in my question, July, about space. Why the inclusion on cooperation in space?
I think that has to do with the Philippines' own initiative to put up its own Philippine Space Agency and then look at the space as a frontier where it has interests in. And the U.S., of course, I think came at top of the mind for Philippine policymakers when it comes to space cooperations. Not to say that there are no other initiatives with other countries. The Philippines is part of the EU's Copernicus program, for example. And there are so many initiatives. I'd like to plug in that we actually, at the Fulbright Commission the Philippines, we signed an agreement with the Philippine Space Agency to send scholars to the United States. But that's actually Philippine resources at play. So that means we're going to spend Filipino taxpayers' money in the US. So that tells you that we are committed to space as an area for development, particularly for scientific progress and national economic development. Actually, the security issue is just secondary to it. But better capacity to monitor, for example, floods, disasters, and so on from space, better transparency when it comes to, let's say, illegal fishing, wildlife exploitation, and so on, and other useful tools. When it comes to space, I think is important regardless of the situation the South China Sea is. In itself, I think it is vital. And there are other areas, of course, aside from space, the digital, cyber, and related areas, I think, where the Philippines, and energy, for example, is another area where the Philippines is looking towards investing more of its resources on and seeking to partner with like-minded states.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. July, thank you so much for taking the time. And Elina, thank you as always for co-hosting. And most importantly, thanks all of you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer. Our intern is Tappy Lung. Our co-hosts were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
See you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.